Okay, yeah. Thanks, Michael, for this nice introduction and thanks for having me. This next talk is about uniting several technologies by means of web components as well as micro apps. And let me introduce myself a bit. I am Manfred, I'm a trainer and consultant, and I'm focusing on Angular. I'm helping companies in Austria and in Germany and sometimes in Switzerland on a regular basis with Angular. For this I'm doing workshops and consultancy. I'm only a proud member like Michael of the Google Developer Expert team. And my current product is also about Angular. It's a workshop for Angular in the enterprise. It tells you all the things you need to know when you want to create enterprise scale applications with Angular. It is provided as a public workshop. We are doing it in Vienna. We, that is Michael and me, in Vienna next month. And there is a discount code, so if you want to stop by, just use this discount code when booking your ticket. It gives you 15%. By the way, we are also doing it as an in-house workshop. So let me start with a picture. Who knows this machine? Yeah, some of you. This is a good old Commodore 64, the hero of my childhood. And it was released back in 1982. Boy, what a number. That really shows that I'm growing old nowadays. And it had 1 megahertz, which is not much compared to nowadays capacities. And it had 64 kilobytes of RAM. And if you were lucky, if you had floppy disks, then you could store 170 kilobytes. Some people didn't have a floppy disk. They used an audio tape to store data for this Commodore 64. What nobody knows is that there was also a dual-core version of it, a version with 2 CPU cores. It looked like this. So you needed to buy 2 of them, and some people did this for programming on the one machine and testing and debugging on the other one. And of course, the biggest challenge back then has been resources. You thought twice about using an integer. Perhaps just a tiny integer was enough. Resources have been very limited. And this was somehow the biggest challenge. Nowadays, we have completely different challenges. I think the biggest challenge nowadays is complexity. Business software gets more and more complex, and we have to maintain it. And in addition to that, we have to coordinate several teams. We have not only to coordinate members of one team, but nowadays there are several teams involved in such a product. UX team, for instance, several programming teams, feature teams, and so on and so forth, and you have to coordinate them. And we also need something like long-time maintainability, because enterprise scale software does not only live for 3 years, it lives for 10 or 20 years, so you have to make sure that you can maintain it in long term. And yeah, well, there's also this issue with milk products. I guess you've heard about it. There are milk products out there lasting longer than some JavaScript framework. So I think it was at the workshop last time, one guy said to the other one, what you are doing is that much 2015. So just do the math. It's not that long, and you are getting finger pointed to you for using technologies from 2015. So something is wrong here. And in this talk, I want to show you several approaches to deal with these issues. I will start with web components, and then I will go on with micro apps, and at the end I have prepared a simple demonstration. So first things first, let's talk about web components. What is a web component? To put it in a nutshell, a web component is a framework-independent component. You can write it with one framework or even with Vanilla.js, and you can use it with all the other frameworks or even with Vanilla.js. And as a byproduct, you have something that is very easy to get dynamically loaded. Lazy loading, dynamic loading has never ever been that simple as with web components. This is a nice byproduct of it. So to be honest, there is not such a thing like a web component, because web components is just the umbrella term for several standards. And here you see the official icons of the standards. The first icon is about templates. I think I don't need to talk much about templates. We all are using templates on a regular basis when we think about Angular or all the other single-page application frameworks. It is just a bunch of HTML tags that are reused on demand. For instance, a bunch of text that is rendered within a loop or something like this. There is a standard called HTML imports, and it's about importing stuff from another HTML file. The idea here was to get other web components from another HTML file by importing this very file. Perhaps the most important standard here is the custom element standard. It allows you to write own elements, own HTML elements, and they really behave like traditional ones. They will behave like a div or a table or an input or an image. You can even deal with them using Vanilla.js or using Angular or other frameworks in the same way. And then there is Shadow DOM, perhaps the most mighty standard here. And it even sounds more mighty when you use a German translation, Schattendom. It really sounds mighty, the Schattendom. And Shadow DOM is quite nice because it isolates your component, which means that the CSS of your component cannot influence other components, which is normally something you want to have. I guess you know those situations where you have two sets of CSS files. Both of them work fine, but when you use them together, all hell breaks loose. So the good message here is, even though we have to remember 4 standards, we can immediately forget about the second one, about HTML imports, because the browser vendors agreed upon not implementing it. They said, hey, we already have something like this, namely ECMAScript imports. And so we will use ECMAScript imports nowadays, and of course even more in the future, to import something from other files. Who is doing business software here? Yeah, most of you, of course. In this case, you need to deal with Internet Explorer 11, most likely. And it is quite a pity because it's such an old browser, but in a big company you have to somehow respect it. And the good message here is you can polyfill all those standards more or less to Internet Explorer 11. Just get started, start with testing early, because not everything can be polyfilled, but you can arrange yourself with the limitations here. The API of web components is also quite easy. What we see here is a simple custom element. It is just a class, normally a ECMAScript 6 class. Of course, it can also be a TypeScript class, and it extends HTML elements. And then within the constructor, you can attach a shadow DOM, which means that you are isolating your component from the rest of the application, and then you can deal with inner HTML or with templates to get some markup into your component. This is a very simple example for a web component. At the end of the day, you have to register your web component, and for this you are going with custom elements define. You define a tag name, and you define your class, the class of your HTML element. And after that, everything you need is to import your bundles, either like here in a static way, or dynamically by dynamically creating a script tag, and then you can reference your HTML element, your brand new HTML element, by using a tag with the defined name. So it is really as simple as that. And it can even get more simpler, because most frameworks provide nowadays support for web components. For instance, when we look at Angular, since Angular 6, that is since last, I think, March, we have Angular Elements. And Angular Elements allows you to export an Angular component to a web component by the snap of a finger. just 1 or 2 lines of boilerplate code, and your Angular component behaves like an ordinary web component. The same holds true for Vue. Using Vue, you can even tell the Vue CLI, please export here this Vue component as a web component. And when it comes to React, well, they are quite reluctant when it comes to supporting web components, but there are community projects out there, community projects that also do the same, that wrap your React component as a web component. Yeah. So this is one thing that helps us to decouple ourselves from a specific framework, one way to write code that can be used even when we are changing the framework. It is more or less the Java philosophy of writing once and using anywhere. Pardon?
Debugging everywhere.
And debugging everywhere, yeah, of course, also this. So the second thing I want to talk about today is micro apps. And we will see in some minutes that micro apps can really benefit from web components. The idea here is quite simple. The idea has been around for, I think, 20 years at least. And it is about not writing a big system that can do anything. Or everything, anything, everything, you know what I mean. So, because when you have a big system that can do all the things you want to have, then maintainability is decreased. You cannot easily change something, because perhaps if you change something here, you break something there. You know this issue with regression. And it is even harder when you have several teams working on this big project, because in this case they have to talk to each other. Talking to each other. No, nothing against collaboration, but when you are ending up more times in meetings than with programming code, then something is wrong. And especially in big companies with big products, you have these issues that you are ending up in too much discussions and that you have too less time for doing your job, which is coding. And of course, when you have a traditional company, you know this, then most of those discussions are politically, which is even more a mess. Changing the framework is not simple here, and also changing the architecture is not simple here. So why would you want to do this? Perhaps you want to do this because you have to maintain your software for 20 years, and perhaps the framework choice or the architecture choice from the last years does not work anymore for the next use case you have to implement. No one knows what happens in some years, and no one can say whether the current decisions are accurate for the things we have to do in the future. So having the possibility to change something easily is very vital in this case. So at the end of the day, you have a system that is hard to change and you cannot invest as many time into programming as you would like. And the idea here is quite simple to solve this. The idea is to split this whole bunch up into several tiny parts. In the back end, we are calling this nowadays microservices. In the front end, you could call it a micro app or perhaps sometimes micro front ends. But the idea is the same. You have tiny self-contained systems that don't need to know much about the other systems, that even work if the other systems are down. And of course, as in software architecture, it's always the case, there are several advantages and disadvantages of this approach. One advantage here is that you get a separate deployment. When you are done with your part of the system, just deploy it. You don't have to wait until all the other teams have been done. When you are done, it gets deployed and your users get immediately value, get immediately the new version. You can mix and match technologies, not because you want to, but because you have to when it comes to software that means to maintain for 10 or 20 years. You have less coordination, less politically motivated discussions with other teams, and you are decreasing your complexity because you are working on a very tiny thing that is focused on one kind of use cases. On the other side, you will end up with a highly distributed system. That means you have to take care about communication, inter-process communication, about providing APIs, REST services, and so on and so forth. You are ending up with distributed data because you have separate applications, and so each of them can have a data store of its own. And you have to deal with UI composition. UI composition means that you have to present your 50 micro apps as a common big thing to the user, because the user is not interested in having 50 micro apps. He or she isn't interested into starting 50 apps every morning. We as programmers are interested into this because of all those advantages here. And so you need to find a way to integrate everything into a common system. As you might imagine, distributed systems and distributed data is something that is concerned to server-side programmers. UI composition has to be done within the UI layer. I think that's why we are calling it UI composition. And for this we have several possibilities. I will start here with the most simple one. It's about using hyperlinks. They have been around for 20 years. And to be honest, I have never ever heard someone to say a bad word about hyperlinks. So this seems to be a major technology. The idea here is that we are ending up with several single page applications, and they are connected to each other using hyperlinks. And if you are looking for an example, the whole Google suite is such an example. For instance, when you look at Google Maps, you see one micro app that is specialized into one task, into working with routes and mapping data or map data. And when you want to have another part of the Google suite, then you click this menu here, and then you can use those hyperlinks that lead you to other parts of the Google suite. Then, of course, another single page application will be loaded. By the way, the most important aspect of this whole presentation can be found on this slide. Perhaps you've seen it. In Germany, in Lower Saxony, there is a city called Steierberg. So I'm really putting a lot of emphasis into that. This is very important for me. So if you don't remember anything of this talk, please always remember there is a city that has the same name like me. It's called Steierberg. Yeah. So now let's go on with the boring technical stuff. Of course, using hyperlinks is simple, but it also means you will lose your application state when transitioning over to another single page application. And it means you have to load a whole new application, which is exactly what we wanted to prevent when we invented single page applications. And somehow you have to make sure that you have a consistent look and feel. That means you have to share some widgets to provide common styling and a common look and feel. And this is where the cycle closes for the first time. For those widgets, web components would be a very good fit because they don't care about your current technology. They don't care about whether you are using Angular for your current single page application or AngularJS or Vanilla.js. Are there other options? I don't think so. You can just use your components and that's it. Of course, sometimes the user deserves something better than hyperlinks. And in those cases, we have to provide a shell. A shell that is capable of loading other micro apps on demand. And for providing shells, there are also different possibilities. And here I will start with the most ugly one. What do you think? What is the ugliest possibility to load one single page application into the middle of another one? Iframes, yeah, you are right. I don't know about you, but I get this strange feeling in the stomach when I'm hearing the word iframe. No, just kidding. Nowadays I'm seeing a lot of iframe-based solutions out there, mainly in the intranet. And they have some advantages, even though they are for sure not the most popular element for web designers. One advantage is it is drop-dead simple to use an iframe. And another advantage is it provides the best amount of isolation. That means that the application in the first iframe cannot harm applications in other iframes. A bug here does not influence the application there. A fishy CSS here does not influence the layout there. And they cannot hack each other, which is especially important when you want to provide a plugin system for partner applications. I have several customers writing I would say RRB-like systems, SAB-like systems, and they want to include some special modules from third-party vendors, and so the iframe is here the best solution in terms of security. Of course, it is not the most beautiful solution. Another solution for this would be to bootstrap several single-page applications. That means you have one index HTML, and within this index HTML you will bootstrap an Angular application, and on demand another Angular application, and on demand an Angular JS application, and so on and so forth. And this is where the circle closes another time, because it can be a good idea to wrap your micro apps that get loaded into your shell into web components. It is not the typical use case of a web component, because here you would end up with a very coarse-grained and a very big web component. But it has some advantages. One advantage is by doing this you get an unified API for the shell. The shell is not interested into the differences of your frameworks. It does not want to know that this micro app is using Angular, and therefore it has to talk with it in this way, and that this micro app is using Vanilla.js, and therefore it has to talk with it that way. We can unify this with web components, which means we are getting something each and every HTML element has, namely properties and events. And it is even possible to nest web components. That means you can use a React component in the middle of your Angular component, which is used in the middle of your, I don't know, Vanilla.js component. And another aspect here is, I've mentioned it before, web components can very easily get lazy loaded. Lazy loading was never as simple as with web components. So when doing this, we can use web components on two levels of our architecture. The first level is what I'm calling the macro architecture. It's about the glue between your micro apps. The part that is holding your micro apps together. You can also call it the host or the shell. And the second level is about sharing widgets. I'm calling this the micro level, or the level with the shared widgets. And in general, it is good to separate those levels when doing architectural discussions, because otherwise you will end up in cycles when doing those discussions. The fact here is you can use completely different solutions for those two levels. For instance, here at macro level, you could also use iframes or hyperlinks, and at micro level, you could also use Angular components provided via a monorepo, or Angular components provided via NPM packages, and so on and so forth. Okay, enough for theory. Let's have a look at a sample application I've prepared. No, here it is. This is my sample application. Wir sehen ein bisschen was. And this application is just a shell. When I'm clicking here, for instance, a whole new Angular application that was wrapped as a web component is loaded here on demand. And when I'm clicking there, another separate Angular application is loaded on demand. You can even use routing here. And you can even start those applications in standalone mode. That means you can test them separately, you can develop on them separately, you can create your own decisions, and when you are done, just deploy it, the shell will load it. So in this case, the shell is nothing else than a browser within your browser, something that makes sure that you can seamlessly switch between your apps. So now let's click here to payment. Whoa, what's this? I promise you, I have never seen this icon before. I don't know what this icon is about, but in my point of view, this really shows that now we can mix and match technologies. And let me also click here. Here I'm loading a traditional AngularJS application. Who is still using AngularJS? Some of you, okay. So using a micro app architecture could be one way to get away from your AngularJS development to something that's new. It even works a bit nicer in some cases than ng upgrade, which really intermingles Angular 1 with Angular 2 quite hard. So this is what I'm calling the macro architecture. It's about the glue between the micro apps. It's about loading micro apps into a shell. But we can also use micro architecture here. For instance, when I'm clicking here or there, I'm reusing widgets from the other clients. That means now I can do something like UI composition and UI integration. Sometimes a tiny part of one use case has also to be a part of another use case, and that's what's possible here because web components can be nested. For instance, here I'm using a web component created with the green technology, with, I never remember its name, with Vanilla.js, or something that has been created alongside my blue Angular client, that can be reached using this hyperlink here. Awesome. Of course, we've discussed now several approaches for creating micro apps. And now the question is, which approach is the right one for my project? And the answer is a typical consultancy answer. It depends. It really depends. And the issue here is that when we are honest, every one of us just wants to have all the advantages of those concepts. No one of us wants to have one of the disadvantages of using hyperlinks, of using iframes, of using web components. And that's why, when doing those discussions with my customers, I'm very open ending up in discussion cycles. And to break those cycles, I had the idea of creating a decision tree that helps us to identify a first fitting architectural candidate. Of course, it is not the last word on this, but it proved to be in handy. The first question I would ask you is, do you have a lot of shared state? And do the users need to move around between the micro apps a lot? Does one use case involve a lot of micro apps? And if you say no, this is not the case, not a lot of shared state, and the users don't need to switch the micro app within a use case, then go with hyperlinks. Create several tiny single page applications, because here the chance is high that they don't need to interact with each other. If you say, hey, here a lot of things are going on, we have a lot of shared state, we have a lot of navigation, then the next question is, do you have to integrate legacy applications like PHP, like ASP.NET, like Java server phases? Or do you need a very, 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 very strong isolation because of integrating plugins from third-party vendors? And then the answer would be try iframes, even though we all know that we will not win an architectural award for using iframes, and even though we know that this is not a good fit for public websites. You will not write the next Amazon using iframes, of course, but it can be fitting for an internal application, a CRM system or an RRP system or something like this. If you say, no, I don't need this, I don't have legacy, I'm rewriting my code every second week, then the next question is, do you even need a separate deployment? Do you even need to mix and match technologies? And when you say yes, then wrap your micro apps in web components and load them on demand. If you say, no, this is not needed, I don't need separate deployments, I just want to have Angular and I want to get happy with Angular, then create a monolith, which is just a nice new term for a traditional big application. And of course, something could help here when creating a monolith, namely using libraries, subdividing your monolith into tiny libraries and subdividing it with a monorepository. A monorepository is just a big application that consists of tiny sub-projects. But as the Selfman said in the Baumax ad on TV, this is a whole other story. So let me come to a conclusion. When you are going with web components, then you can decouple yourself from a current framework. And when you go with micro apps, then you can even decouple teams and projects that can work individually. And when you are combining web components and micro apps, I guarantee you beautiful things will happen. And on the other side, you can also choose the best technology for your current project when going with micro apps, because you can do an own technology decision for your current use case. So thanks for having me. Here you find my coordinates. You can download my slides and my example on my blog. You also find a whole blog article about this. And perhaps if you're interested in those topics, in our workshops we will address this topic as well as also other topics next month in Vienna or in-house anytime. So thanks for having me and have a nice day.